A conversation with Congressman Mark Pocan this morning on For the Record. Good morning, I'm Neil Heinen. It's been 3 months this past week since Mark Pocan was sworn in to represent Wisconsin's 2nd Congressional District. Pocan succeeded new Senator Tammy Baldwin in the House, just as he succeeded her in the State Assembly, where he served 7 terms. It's a pleasure to welcome back to For the Record in his new position, Congressman Mark Pocan. Congressman, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Neil. Glad to be here.
So, how's it sitting with you? What do you think?
Every week I feel like I'm getting a little better grasp of how things are in Washington. I think a lot of people ask, is it truly as dysfunctional as it appears? And it really is in many ways very dysfunctional. But that just gives you the challenge of figuring out how to get things done in a city that isn't really set up to work quite as well as it should.
Do you need to get into the rhythm out there? Is there a learning curve having to do with meetings and appointments and constituent visits, all the stuff that go with this job?
It's a heavy schedule. From the legislature to Congress, I think some of the biggest difference is just the sheer volume of what comes in. So, my average day usually starts around 8 a.m. Usually I get released somewhere between 8 and 10 p.m. and then I go and do my reading for the next day. So it's a very tight schedule. During that time, I don't know if there's an open 15-minute period that you're not either doing meetings, you're in committee work, you're voting on the floor, you're doing something that relates to the job. So that keeps the pace going really quickly. And then, we've been doing a lot of meetings too, just trying to develop relationships with people, getting to know people, both Democrats and Republicans, that I'm going to be working with hopefully for a long time.
You realize you're going to have to protect against burnout at some point.
Yeah, one of the nice things is when I can come back home.
Yeah.
It's always best to be back home in the district, and this week has been one of those weeks. So we've been getting around to Iowa County and Rock County and Greene County and getting across the district, and that's always my favorite.
And what are you flying out on Monday, flying back on Friday, or is that?
It depends on the week, but generally it's a Sunday night fly out and come back on usually a Thursday or Friday night, depending. Sometimes it's as short as a day and a half I get back for. Sometimes it might be 3 or 4 days. It just depends on our vote schedule.
Mark, what are the issues that just even in this first 3 months have really taken a lot of your attention and time?
Well, I think being on the budget committee, we started out with the budget process right away. And the budget process is very different than what I was used to here in the legislature, where I spent 6 years on our budget committee and I was co-chair of the committee. We spent 8 hours a day, 3 days a week for 3 or 4 months drafting a budget, and every line meant something. We really put a lot of thought into it. It's not that way in Washington. We literally had a budget introduced one week. The next day we were marking it up, and the next day it was in front of the whole House. And then you have a separate version of a budget between the House and the Senate and the President. And then we're not getting together to have a final version of a budget. And what that means is we wind up kind of kicking the can, doing continuing resolutions, not putting a lot of thought into what should be, I think, your most thoughtful document you have, which is your guiding document, the budget. So coming and seeing the difference between what I did in the legislature and what we really should do probably differently in Congress, that's consumed a lot of my time being on that budget committee, sequestration, etc.
Since the budget is such a focus, and let's just start there in terms of sort of the public's perception of Congress's ability to govern. The budget has been a focus of gridlock, of just this partisan divide. What's your sense of that, and how do you work within that?
Yeah, it's frustrating. Even before we were sworn in, they started our official training. Our first official training was 2 weeks, and there are 81 freshmen, 49 Democrats, 32 Republicans. They separated us for all but one dinner and one reception for 2 weeks. So they teach you bad behavior from the very beginning. So there's no surprise that when you get to the budget process, I understand you're going to have different documents out of the House, different houses, and the president have another document. But that means that's the starting point. The next part is the hard work, where we actually sit down in a conference and work out those differences and then have a national budget that's our guiding principles for the next year in Congress. And instead, they don't do that next step. They enjoy the fighting and introducing the documents that are completely different. But right now, we can't get the House Republicans to appoint conferees so that we can actually sit down and debate those budgets to have a final document. And I think the last 3 years we haven't had a budget governing the country. So that means continuing resolutions. It means you keep funding bad programs. You don't really fund the things you should invest more in. and it's a rather thoughtless process to how a budget is done. So again, that's part of my when I talk about the budget and I talk about sequestration, I see a lot of problems that I wasn't part of the creation of. And I think the good news is, having this many freshmen, none of us were a part of some of these problems, and maybe we can look at things a little differently and try to bring about some change.
Is there a freshman caucus? I mean, do you meet with the other freshmen and talk about what perhaps the 40 some of you might be able to bring influence to?
Somewhat, but they don't really have a formal caucus with all the freshmen.
No, I thought it'd be
know
informal,
people, a little bit from your training. One of the things I am really proud to be a part of is there's a problem solvers caucus, which is created by a group called No Labels. It's a bipartisan caucus. It's a concept that should be as basic as something an elementary school student would understand, which is just getting to know each other in a bipartisan way, getting to talk through some issues, and then seeing what you have in common with other people, so you can maybe then introduce some legislation. And there's about just over about 50 to 60 members of that caucus. So a little over 10% of the House. It's just about evenly split. 3 of us from Wisconsin are part of it: Reed Ribble, myself, and Tom Petri. And I think the idea has been working really well. I've got to know people that I wouldn't have maybe otherwise had access to, Republicans and Democrats, so you get to know what you have in common. I'm a small business owner, they're a small business owner, and you kind of find out where your values are. So there's some positive things like that I think we're going to try to introduce some legislation a little later this summer as a caucus. But it's certainly not set up. Washington is not set up to function well. I mean, there's so many barriers to that, and I think coming from the legislature, where even though we've had our problems, I think we functioned a lot better here back in the state.
Yeah, I mean, Congressman Petri is a great example. He's a veteran. I respect him for doing that. But again, the perception is that leadership in both houses in Congress are so removed from that kind of a perspective that I mean, I don't know how how do you even relate to leadership at that level when they are so politically, ideologically rigid in what they're even willing to consider.
Yeah, and it goes beyond just that. It goes to the amount of time that people spend in Washington. Sometimes, if they don't get back home and really talk to real people in their districts, you start to have that beltway thinking, and I think that happens way too often.
And a lot of them don't, right?
They don't. And if they are, they're not listening to people. One of the things I've noticed is on some issues that I've taken some roles on active early in my tenure, it's a number of us who are freshmen who wind up speaking out because we've just been back home.
Right.
We just went through a campaign and talked to real people. So when they talk about cuts to Social Security and things like that, we've just been talking to real people, and we can maybe have a different perspective than folks who've just been around for a while and are used to the inside the beltway way of doing things.
You mentioned sequestration a couple of times. When we come back, I think we'll start there just as an issue to talk about with Congressman Mark Pocan.
It's true that the sequester is in place right now. It's damaging our economy, it's hurting our people, and we need to lift it. What's clear is that the only way we're going to lift it is if we do a bigger deal that meets the test of lowering our deficit and growing our economy at the same time. And that's going to require some compromises on the part of both Democrats and Republicans.
President Obama, from his news conference earlier this week, talking about, among other things, sequestration. Congressman Mark Pocan is my guest this morning, and I mean, first of all, that word is just, it's so hard for people to get their heads around, but just from your perspective now, what do people need to know? What does the 2nd Congressional District need to know about sequestration?
First of all, this is one of these classic Washington ideas. Only people in Washington could come up with a concept and a word, sequestration. No one says you're going to sequester your child's toys if they don't behave, right? So only Washington could even start with a concept so confusing. But essentially what it is they couldn't agree on some budget items last year, so they said, let's create something that's so awful that both sides will disagree with, that it'll force us to the table to actually make some hard decisions that so far Congress hasn't been able to do. So it got to the deadline, and rather than sitting down and making those tough decisions, they said, well, let's just keep this in place. The problem is it's a blunt cut across the board on discretionary spending, and discretionary is just a type of the overall spending we have in Congress. But what that means is you're cutting a lot of really good programs, and you're continuing funding for a lot of really bad programs. So rather than doing the hard work of saying this program is a waste of taxpayer dollars, we should cut funding this, and this is a valuable program, we need to invest more, sequestration just does across the board about a 5% cut in everything. So the problem is, as much as we may not like a program, like I often hear about the TV studio at the IRS, a lot of people bring that up. Well, then cut the program. Right now we cut 5% of it, but we also cut 5% of Meals on Wheels funding for seniors, and 5% of funding for a Head Start program, and all these other programs. And the bottom line is it'll cost about 36,000 jobs in Wisconsin between now and September 30th. And then we're doing little piecemeal fixes, things like what we just did last week with airports during the continuing resolution. Again, lack of a budget, we passed that. Got money for meat inspectors so that places like Oscar Mayer can still operate every day. But Congress needs to act more holistically, but instead of taking the actions to make tough decisions, they do things like sequestration, and it has a negative impact. It was created to be terrible, and now we're all living through this, and it's going to last for 10 years.
At the heart of a lot of this, or what at least will emerge regularly, is philosophical differences about the deficit and the debt, and stimulus spending and growing the economy. And what's frustrating is that there are really nuanced differences, I think, within parties on a lot of this stuff. But we never get to it because the politics of it demand, that they be pitted against each other. Where are you, Mark, personally, on the deficit and debt and what the government should do right now?
Sure. I mean, there's no question we have to address our deficit and debt. But what we've been told, and this is part of being on the budget committee, I'm fortunate enough to get exposure to some of the best economists in the country, but also our nonpartisan agencies like the Congressional Budget Office. 3/4 of the nation's deficit in the next year that we're supposed to be doing a budget for right now is caused by economic weakness. In other words, unemployment and underemployment. What that tells me, the small business owner in me, the legislator in me, is that we should be doing everything we can to grow the economy and help create jobs now. That means investing in infrastructure, investing in research and development, investing in education, so that the economy can grow, more people become taxpayers, and ultimately that solves a lot of our trajectory problems in the future. So we have to do that in order to really grow ourselves out of it. To just look at the holy grail of the debt number and ignore everything in our right now reality that everyone's experiencing with the unemployment is a real problem. So that's a couple of the bigger debates, but I think the best way we solve those long-term issues is to deal with the short-term of dealing with the economy and really getting it up and going. And things like the sequester have the exact opposite effect. They hurt the economy in the short run, which we can't afford to do.
So where do you stand on so-called entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and their role in all of this?
Sure. I think the first thing we should do, because I think where you can find more commonalities between Democrats and Republicans, is there's plenty of things that I would call in the waste, fraud, and abuse category. We've had GAO reports that have showed us areas where there's duplicative programs across federal government. We should be attacking that. We should be going after some of the tax expenditures that maybe don't benefit the public in general. So if we could address some of those, that's how you start to get rid of some of the wasteful spending that's out there. But I think we have to remember that it wasn't Social Security and Medicaid that caused our economic situation we're in now. It was because of the housing crisis and the financial crisis, and I would hate to see us go too quickly or turn in a wrong direction on some of those programs. I mean, we have to realize we have a population that's living longer, and those are all factors. I think that one of the biggest things is healthcare expenses have risen faster than the rest of the economy. Those are issues we've got to look at, but I think that's important before you start changing programs that people have paid into their entire life. We should be addressing some of the drivers of those cost increases.
I feel like we've got so many things we want to get to. Everything you say reminds me of something else. You mentioned healthcare. There now seem more and more Democrats who are concerned about the Health Care Act and probably stuff that we just, we weren't able to anticipate, perhaps some of the effects. How are you looking at the Affordable Health Care Act right now?
I think the general idea behind the Affordable Health Care Act is very strong, right? Making sure that people who have pre-existing conditions can get access to health care, adult children can stay on policies, we invest more in preventive care. Those are all strong aspects. I think the biggest concern that I have, along with other Democrats and Republicans that I've heard talk about this, is that we don't have a lot of information about the implementation that's coming up really quickly. So this week, for example, we brought in people from the Small Business Administration regional office in Chicago here to sit down with small business owners, not only to talk about some really good programs the SBA has, but also the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, because we can't get answers. If I can't get answers as a member of Congress, can you imagine how tough it would be for a small business trying to figure out how that implementation is going to affect their small business? So it's a concern we have that I think there's some really strong value to the Affordable Care Act that will benefit the public as a whole. But if we can't flesh out some of these details, you could take a really great program and have it implemented poorly. And it's always the devil's in the details, and I think that's that period we're in right now.
So, I mean, that's frustrating because it suggests that the Health Care Act is perhaps a sound policy, but if they're not doing a good enough job explaining what it is, and where does the fault lie for that?
Exactly. I'll tell you, we requested the department has oversight, couldn't give us answers. They told us until they have regional offices, they can't get us answers. And we, just because we work a lot with small businesses in the district, found out the SBA has realized that, and they've come up very much on their own with some of the responses so they can help small businesses understand what's coming down the pike. But I think it's unacceptable to have an oversight agency not be able to give us answers, not only the public and the businesses that have to implement this, but as a member of Congress, if I can't help my constituents through the process, that's a real problem. So it's a very, I think, solid bill with really good, strong benefits for the public. But I'm weary that they better start moving very quickly on getting us the proper information so that people can really make sure they're ready to be able to implement the act.
We're going to continue our conversation with Congressman Mark Pocan when we come back right after this. I'm back with Congressman Mark Pocan. 3 months since he was sworn in as the 2nd Congressional District Representative from the state of Wisconsin. You know, let me ask you this, Mark, just leading into a conversation about LGBT rights in Congress and some legislation there. This past week, one of the big stories was Jason Collins from the NBA coming out as gay. Just from your perspective, and in terms of the call from President Obama and sort of the response to that.
Sure.
How does that, what's the significance of this, do you think?
Well, you know, this is, again, where the public is so far ahead of our alleged leaders, right? 58% of the people in the country support marriage equality. From 18 to 29-year-olds, it's 81% support. Yeah. This is where the country's going, and when you find people in one of the areas that probably was the last bastions of where someone might come out, professional sports, that's now happening. It's just people are realizing the reality of we have a lot of LGBT folks who are in our communities who are producing and active members of the society, and we deserve those equal rights. So again, the public is so far ahead, but we've got to drag some of the folks in Congress who spend a little too much time in Washington, D.C. and don't talk to their constituents across so they can understand that, and we can have laws in place that provide for equal treatment under the law.
Do you think we're making too much of it? Do you worry that, I mean, Jason Collins is being made out to be a hero?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, part of it is just in order to make those leaders change the laws that negatively affect people, you have to continue to talk about it. I mean, look at reducing gun violence. Over 90% of the public support those simple background check fixes, and we couldn't pass a bill in the Senate because of Senate rules. I think people get really frustrated with Washington when something that has strong support for real change that's needed, and we can't get something done. So in this area, I think it's that repetitive message that people kind of realize when your family members and your friends and your neighbors and people you admire and you see on TV are talking about equality, it makes it easier for us to finally get there.
When the Supreme Court was considering the cases before it, there was a daily scorecard of members of Congress that were changing their position on gay marriage, and it did begin to create this sense of inevitability. Is the lobby against it so strong that we're still a year or two out, or do you think it is inevitable now?
I think the big thing is the court decisions that are going to come this summer from the Supreme Court will probably guide where the next part of that conversation goes, because they've taken two major cases, and that could or could not open up the door for a faster approach towards equality. But you have to understand, when you talk to some folks in Congress who are very rigid in their beliefs and maybe not listening to their constituents, it's tough on a wide variety of issues. Why don't we have a national budget? That should be a no-brainer, and yet we don't get it done. Why aren't we doing more about the economy and helping create jobs? Should be a no-brainer, but we can't quite get it done. So I think sometimes we just have to continue to have these conversations to get the right people to be changing the attitudes that we need to match the public.
I want to just raise another, because I know you're working on this, the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. As you probably are aware, because it's been talked about more and more, and we've had a lot of briefings on this in Congress, is cyber attacks are becoming one of the newest areas that are emerging as a problem as a country. We went through different types of terrorism, and this is probably the most recent area where it's affecting both businesses and government. So there's important provisions we need to do to make sure we can share information to deal with things. However, the bill that came through right now through the House didn't have, in my opinion, adequate protections for the public to make sure that they're not sharing too much information, the private data, and also that they have to provide some protections as they're sharing data, that they're not sharing things they shouldn't be sharing. So I think the Senate and the President, from what I've heard, are going to take a look at that bill and try to make some very necessary changes to protect privacy. And I think when it comes back through the House, hopefully we'll have a bill that'll work. We've passed a number of other measures that'll help us towards this as well, but I think that's one where the privacy aspect is really important, and we need a little more work than what the House did on that bill. We
just have a minute and a half left, Mark, but this past Monday, I was at a day of briefings at the State Department, and Secretary Kerry, through a half a dozen undersecretaries, presented a pretty rosy picture of foreign affairs. And I mean, granted, you might expect them to do that, but this was a group of editorial writers. A lot of the information was on background. And I just wondered, what is your perspective in terms of national security right now in some of the hot button areas? That,
well, I mean, we're bringing a lot of troops home, right? We're almost out of the hot spots that we've had, and I think we are entering a period of time where we are in relative peace. I mean, there's always specific areas like Syria and North Korea that we're watching very, very closely. The Middle East is always, because of some of the new governments in there, something that we're watching. But in general,
but promise in Afghanistan, promise in,
exactly.
I mean, you see that as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think some of the concern we still have is the Syrian government is probably going to fall at some point, but I don't think they've quite accepted that. North Korea, you've got someone who's a dictator who's making a lot of rather irrational statements, but they also don't have some of the capacity, the muscle to prove what they're trying to. So I think when you look at that, if those are some of our biggest threats, we're in a good period where I think hopefully that'll make us focus more on the economy and creating jobs, what we should be doing to make our country even stronger.
Thanks, Congressman.
Yeah, thank you,
Let's
Neil.
do this
Appreciate
regularly.
it. Absolutely.
We'll come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. My thanks to Representative Mark Pocan for being here today. Next week, we'll talk about diversity in the workplace and how it can lead to business innovation and growth. That's next Sunday. See you then.